We will start the second session now with the lecture of Professor Dr. Dirk Uffelmann. Dirk Uffelmann will give a lecture on Polish perspectives on German Ostkolonisation. Professor Dirk Uffelmann is a professor of East and West Slavic Studies at Justus Liebig University Giessen and co-editor of Zeitschrift für Slawische Philologie. He studied Russian, Polish, Czech and German literatures at the universities of Tübingen, Vienna, Warsaw and Constance. He obtained his PhD from the University of Constance and defended his second thesis, Habilitation, at the University of Bremen. Before that, teaching as a lecturer in Russian at the University of Edinburgh. From 2006 to 2019, he taught as a professor of Slavic literatures and cultures at the University of Passau, where he also served as a vice president for academic and student affairs from 2011 to 2014. His research interests are Russian, Polish, Czech, Slovak, and Ukrainian literature, religion, migration, postcolonial gender, and internet studies. He has authored 4 various monographs. For today, probably the most important one is Polska literatura postkolonialna, Polish postcolonial literature.
Bardzo dziękuję za zaproszenie i życzliwe wprowadzenie. Proszę o wyrozumiałość, że ja rzeczywiście odczuwam potrzebę zacząć od języka polskiego. Będąc po raz pierwszy w Państwowym Instytucie Akademickim Polskim na terenie pruskiej stolicy kolonialnej, ja jako Niemiec bez korzeni polskich muszę zacząć mówić jako gest antykolonialny po polsku. And now sorry for the colonial gesture of switching to the global colonial language, English. Anyway, I'm happy to be here and have the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on Polish literature, German Eastern colonialism, and, which you might have less expected, Native Americans. Polish culture of the 19th century is to a considerable extent reactive. For one thing, it is a reaction to factual history, namely that of Prussia's, Russia's, as well as the Habsburg Empire's instigation of Poland's partition, and the various forms of colonization Poland has had to deal with, Germanization and Russification in the respective Polish sub-territories. Following the suppression of the January Revolt in 1863-64, an explicitly colonial process executed by the Prussian Colonial Commission came into operation. Here is the building where it was executed from, now part of Uniwersytet Adama Mickiewicza. In the course of this development, land was bought from Polish landowners with administrative and financial support from the Prussian government. After 1894, this government activity was supported by anti-Polish propaganda from the German Ostmark Society. The aim of these anti-Polish activities was the complete obliteration of Polish language and culture. This attempt to annihilate Polish culture has time and again been collated with the vanishing of another ethnic group, the Native Americans. A prominent figure applying this analogy to the Prussian-Polish situation was Frederick the Great. Here is a dictum passed on by d'Alembert. The king has allegedly called the new acquisition a piece of anarchy. He has compared it to Canada and the population with the Iroquois Indians. Order and higher moral values were established here only through the Prussian reign. Most successfully received during the 19th century was Gustav Freytag's novel Debit and Credit, published in 1855. It deals with the development of the fictional character Anton Wohlfahrt, who lives in the Polish-Prussian borderlands. This novel could easily be classified as colonial literature set in Europe, that is. What is more, in Debit and Credit, the protagonist, after having read Cooper's The Last Mohican also puts the Polish iconographically into resonance with the American Indians by declaring them as phenotypically dark-skinned. As Isabella Surend observes in Freitag, images of savagery found their expression in the stereotype of the Polish Indian. In his desire to diffuse German civilization, Wohlfahrt, however, is surprised by the moments of mimicry with which he is confronted. The Polish Indians' imperfect imitations of Germans, allegedly civilized by behavior, irritate him, something Homi Bhabha has extensively written about in the context of British India. If the German Eastern colonial, Ostkoloniale Literatur, developed a tendency to see a danger in the adaptation of German civilization by the Polish, how then did Polish journalism and literature receive, appropriate, and from time to time invert the German colonial discourse? The Polish discourse not only responds to the concrete politics of Germanization, but also to the Germanization discourse in general, for example, by using symbolic Indianness. The literal quotation of the aforementioned statement by Frederick II in Ludwig Povidai's 1864 essay, Poles and Indians, underlines this assumption. In this essay, Povidai equates the Indians and the Polish. He sees both as victims of a forced process of civilization, which turned out to be a threat and would finally lead to extinction. The best-known application of the German negative heterostereotype of Polish Indians surfaces in the work of Henryk Sienkiewicz, a pioneer traveler to North America. Although constantly confronted with Russian repression in his private life, Sienkiewicz's early works, for example, Bartek the Winner, mostly include accounts of Prussian colonialist activities, as well as Polish reactions to it. Sienkiewicz's oeuvre has both an anti-Russian tendency and an anti-German undertone, especially in his Teutonic Knights. Lesser known are Sienkiewicz's pertinent journalistic works, which have a relevant connection to his novels and short stories. The anti-colonial position adopted by Sienkiewicz can be perfectly illustrated through his journalism. Just one example. His open letter on Prussian violence from 1901 attracted attention in virtually all the countries of Western Europe. In this letter, Sienkiewicz argued that the history of Prussian repression can be traced back to Frederick the Great. As Sienkiewicz openly criticizes Prussian colonial ambitions in his journalistic work and often makes literal use of the term colonialism, it makes sense to give his perceptions of colonialism and rhetorical strategies of resistance to it a closer look. In 1876, Sienkiewicz began his journey to the United States. In March, he reached New York City and quickly headed out west. 2 years later, in March 1878, he returned to New York City on his way home. His journey had two fairly opposite objectives. On the one hand, he was a US correspondent for Gazeta Polska. On the other hand, he entertained the idea of settling in the United States. Accordingly, his letters from America shifted in terms of genre between letter, feuilleton style, and report. Sienkiewicz's depictions of the indigenous people bear witness to the campfire-inspired romantic search for the exotic and the adventurous. This seems to reflect the fascination generated by the reading of James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, which established a stereotypical image of Indians. It is crucial to note that he shows sympathy with the Indian strategy of defense. The protagonist of Sienkiewicz's first Indian novella, Orso, is an exemplary case of the blending of the beastly savage and the noble savage. Sienkiewicz tells of the love that develops between the husky but affectionate circus artist, Orso, a half-blood Indian, and a 13-year-old blonde girl, Jenny. The narrator definitely shows racist tendencies when, for example, he ennobles Orso's red nature by lightening his skin culture. Tortured by a cruel circus director, Orso and Jenny escape into the prairie together, where they find refuge by returning to Indian life. Sienkiewicz goes beyond Cooper by fictionally depicting an interracial relationship. How far does Sienkiewicz take such Indian metonymies in the Polish context? Not that far, if one believes the assessment of scholars of the present day. According to almost all of them, Sienkiewicz stopped short of using a clear metaphorical equation of Indian with Polish. By using Sachem, another novella by Sienkiewicz, as a point of reference, I will argue that the opposite is the case. The novella is set in Texas, in Antilopa, a German settlement once called Czaja, and I quote, "This was the capital of the Black Snakes, who at that time were giving the German frontier settlements of Berlin, Gründenau, and Harmonie so much trouble that the settlers were not able to preserve any longer. In fact, the Indians were only defending their territory, most solemnly granted to them by the state of Texas, for as long as the grass will grow and the rivers flow. But why should that have bothered the colonizers of Berlin, Gründenau, and Harmonie?" I deliberately pronounce it very, very German because it's important in the Polish original as well. The natives are almost completely annihilated during a devious nocturnal pillage by the German settlers. When the Germans find silver near their settlement, even the last survivors of the tribe are lynched. The German colonizers justify their robbery and occupation with their civilizing mission, quote, "Assuredly, they took the soil, air, and water away from the black snakes, but they brought them civilization instead." In this context, international law is unmasked as a cynical cover for the law of those in power. What is hidden behind this is a crude form of Germanization, which is reflected in the Polish narrative by the insertion of German texts in terms in the text. 2 Tagblatts and a Montagsrevue were published in the city. After the slaughter, the colonizers pass over into a Philistine idyll. Describing the daily life of the colonizers in Texas, Sienkiewicz draws on stereotypes such as German industriousness and their beer garden mentality. The long-forgotten massacre is recalled in the Philistine mind when a traveling circus visits Antilopa. Red Vulture, the last member of the Black Snake tribe, ironically performs at exactly the place where his ancestors were slaughtered by the German settlers 15 years before. The circus program introduces Red Vulture as Sachem, chief of the Black Snakes, last descendant of those tribal kings and last of his lineage, by which Sienkiewicz alludes to Cooper's Last Mohican. Regarding the audience, Sienkiewicz ironizes the exoticizing interest in Native Americans, quote, "In order to show those spouses and sons imported from Germany who had never seen an Indian in their lives, the last of the tribe of the Black Snakes," end quote. In this context, however, the stereotypical image of the brutal savage in its racist and bestializing version is crucial. The Native American is perceived as not quite white. I obviously allude to Barber again, but quote Sienkiewicz, "the face as if molded from copper." And according to the program, he ought to perform leaps like an antelope. The scene above is preceded by the attraction-seeking warning of the circus director, inviting the audience to behave exceptionally quietly, not to applaud, and to keep completely reposed because the chief was extraordinarily aggravated and much wilder than usual. Graham Huggan would call this post-colonial exoticism. As intended, the audience is worried that the Indian circus acrobat might not have forgotten his Indian roots and the slaughter of his ancestors. As it turns out, Red Vulture sings about his own life story. In the song, he recalls the pillage of the Black Snakes tribe's settlement by the Germans and showcases himself as the last remaining agent of this tribe, seeking revenge. With his autobiographical Song of Revenge, Sienkiewicz invokes a pretext established by Adam Mickiewicz. In the poem Konrad Wallenrod, which is about a Lithuanian who avenges himself on Teutonic knights by committing treason against them, the protagonist also performs biographically inspired songs of revenge. The Wallenrod subtext takes the reader in the direction of surmising that Red Vulture will proceed to anti-colonial counter-violence. His equipping with stereotypical nightmarish Indian weapons further underlines this: a tomahawk and knife for scalping. Things turn out unexpectedly, however. Red Vulture proves to be a domesticated warrior of the circus. Obviously, in his etymological denotation, the modern circus still adheres to the historical location in which slaves entertained the audiences of their suppressors during late antiquity, instead of revolting against them. The circus is foredoomed as an arena of artificial revolt. Red Vulture performs a song of revenge in the language of the colonizer, and I quote again, "The chief is chanting in German. This is completely understandable. It is to be assumed that he has forgotten the language of the Black Snakes." The Indian's German, however, seems to be defective, almost the same, but not quite, to quote Barber a third time. The moment Red Vulture reaches the oil lamp at the end of the tight rope illuminating the circus ring, he screams furiously with rage. Then the Indian, however, holds out a tin can, asking the audience for a donation in the voice of the supplicant. "Anything to spare for the last of the Black Snakes?" The somewhat conscience-stricken spectators are seemingly relieved and very willing to tip the Indian for his performance. Even more disillusioning is the ending of the novella. Quote, "After the performance, the sachem drank beer and ate dumplings at the Bierhaus zur goldenen Sonne." In the end, the protagonist remains nothing else than a sexual curiosity in the sense of Robert Young's colonial desire. The man achieved great fame in Antilopa, in particular with the ladies. The sexual fascination delivers no serious social impact. The politically explosive colonial scenes are reduced to private micro-scenes, trivialized and thus neutralized. Toward the end of the novella, Sachem turns into nothing more than a sexually potent but militarily castrated post-Wallenrod. As the once proudly used term for a tribal chief, Sachem serves as the name for a circus acrobat who turns his aggressions into begging for charity, we are obviously faced with a very defensive attitude. What remains for the last tribal member is an inhibited aggression transferred to the realm of language and sentiments, which factually spells resentment. In terms of literary history, it is interesting to see how a scenario of inhibited aggression, which is preceded by military conflict, is constructed under a positivist imprint. The positivism thus seems to be, as Sachem in Sienkiewicz's novella, a post-conflict manifestation of a previous colonial subjugation. The linguistic mimicry of the Indian is an instrument of submission rather than a creative and subversive act of resistance. Has Adam Mickiewicz's romantic Konrad Wallenroth, with his anti-colonial strategy of betrayal, been superseded by Sienkiewicz's Indian circus acrobat, who is full of resentment? Is Sienkiewicz parodying the romantic narrative of betrayal? Without a doubt, the failed Polish revolt of 1863 was followed by a feeling of resignation. It would, however, be one-dimensional to see Sienkiewicz's novella as a mere reflection of the pessimistic mood back then. It is no coincidence that the settlers exterminating the Black Snake tribe are Germans. Definitely no coincidence are the names of the German settlements in Texas. As Samuel Sandler remarks, the names of the three settlements, Berlin, Gründenau, and Harmonie, are repeated 4 times, and every few lines an additional German word is mentioned. These references to German and to Prussia turned Sachem into the most Polish novella among Sienkiewicz's American texts. The fact that the German colonizers do not care about the treaty guarantees warranted for the Indian territories by the Texan state alludes to the manner in which Prussia, Russia, and Austria treated Poland during the threefold partition. Considering these metaphorical leaps, Zdzisław Najder's thesis, arguing that only after his return to Poland in 1878 did Sienkiewicz develop a sensitivity to possible analogies between America's internal colonialism with its victims, the Indians, and the oppression of Poland, is noteworthy. Sachem was written in 1883, the period between the author's return from the United States and the intensification of nationalistic and rather militant tendencies in Sienkiewicz's work around 1894-95. The text can thus be seen as an intermediate step between his positivistic and post-conflict attitude of resentment on the one hand and the new neo-romantically biased militancy developed by the Polish writer on the other. Sachem can be interpreted as testimony for the critical distancing of Sienkiewicz, the positivist, from the own routines as a colonized personality. Why has Sachem been republished so often? Why does it belong to the school canon, lectura szkolna? Because Sachem eventually offers a wider allegorical reading. The narrative can be read as a depiction of the impotent rage of the colonized, and at the same time as a provocative game directed at the colonizers' fear of revenge, i.e., a Polish revolt. The humiliation that the reader feels over Sachem's resignation functions as a kind of antidote. Thus, Sachem is less a parody and more a sequel to Konrad Wallenroth, implemented by a reversal of means. It is an incitement to resistance, not by depicting a successful conspiracy against the oppressor, but instead by describing the negative consequences of not mounting any form of resistance at all. Sienkiewicz subtly incites resistance by depicting the consequences of a lack thereof. The negatively classified identification of the Iroquois with the Polish by Frederick the Great, who, according to him, must be colonized, has thus been successfully turned over. Auto-Indianization serves as a mean of defiant self-assertion. The Polish author wrests the Indian heterostereotype from the Prussians and appropriates it as a symbol for the victims of brutal colonization. Thus, Polish auto-Indianization needs to be read as an anti-colonial act. Thank you for your attention. We will have a joint discussion in the end.
Okay, so now our second speaker in this panel, a bit different than stands in the program, but I hope it's not a problem for anyone. So Ihor Usatenko will be speaking about Nazi colonialism in interwar Polish reportage. And Ihor Usatenko is the head of the Ukrainian editorial office in the Polish press agency. His main journalistic materials are mostly the interviews with well-known Ukrainian and foreign intellectuals. Usatenko is a historian by training. He graduated from the Mechnikov Odessa National University in 2010. He has also completed a postgraduate study in world history. In 2017, Usatenko successfully defended his PhD thesis. His research project was entitled Socio-Political Development of the Capitalist Society in the Concept of Immanuel Wallerstein. After that, he used to work in a public higher educational establishment, Vinnytsia Academy of Continuing Education, and Vasil Stus Donetsk National University. Usatenko has been a participant of scholarship program of the government of the Republic of Poland for young academics. He has completed many internships, scholarships, and residential grants in institutions such as the Institute of Political Sciences of the Polish Academy of Sciences, Faculty of Sociology of the University of Warsaw, Center for Urban History in Lviv, Ukraine, Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, and Sofia University St. Clement Ochrydzki in Sofia in Bulgaria. His research interest spans the world system analysis, historical macrosociology, historical didactics, and memory studies. Please.
Good evening. Do you hear me well? Are you hear me?
You have to use your mic.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Więc w nawiązaniu do ustalonej przez pana profesora tradycji może zacznę od języka polskiego i od podziękowania Instytutowi Pileckiego za zaszczyt obecności tutaj. It's a big honor for me to be here among you, representatives of different academics, despite the fact that I am still in Warsaw. So my topic is Nazi colonialism in interwar Polish reportage, and I would like to begin my presentation by making a couple of theoretical remarks about the essence of Nazi colonialism, because firstly we should actually ask ourselves and try to tell, is it actually appropriate to apply colonial categories to Nazi Germany? Because malicious Nazi practices, which were based on racism, anti-Semitism, belief in conspiracy, and justification, rather are not the same as typical colonial categories in the imperial Germany, and it carries somewhat different connotations in the minds both of ordinary people and historians. I think that, like any comparison and generalization, such matching may be useful only to the extent that it preserves its explanatory and heuristic potential. However, even if we move away from comparing, let's say, completed Nazi projects to exploitative colonialism and their long-term aspiration to settler colonialism, I believe it is necessary to emphasize that the colonial delusions of the Germans have always been a part of modernization and nation-building projects. Professor Mihran Dabak from the University of Bochum wrote about the interdependence between the structures of colonial construction of the image of reality and, from the other side, national programs and the concepts of the future. In other words, the German national project was one of those that was inseparably linked to nation-building processes within the country. According to this German scholar, the colonial programs of the late 19th century contain aspects of modern societies, namely national vows of salvation, the formation of a vision of progress and universal morality, the conceptualization of modernization or appropriation of order, and so on and so forth. All these elements serve on great mission, namely to create a myth about a future without violence and conflicts, a future where the German nation has to play a legitimate dominant role. That is why this author and a number of other researchers have written that to a large extent the classical toolkit used by Nazis also included the principles of political and economic centralization, militarism, cultural influence, and a belief of civilizing mission. On the other hand, we should not forget that the Nazi leaders themselves often opposed previous colonial experience and previous colonial policy through their own plans to conquer territories within the Europe. For example, Hitler wrote that the National Socialists were putting an end to entire foreign policy of pre-war period and wanted to return to the point at which territorial expansion had been interrupted 600 years ago. Here is a quote. We want to stop the eternal German desire to move south and west of Europe and expressly point our finger at the territories in the east. We are finally breaking with the colonial and trade policy of the pre-war period and are deliberately moving to a policy of conquering new lands in Europe, wrote Hitler in his Mein Kampf. In order to develop pride in your own nation, it was necessary to develop a pride and a collective belief, in its own ethos. It was necessary or maybe beneficial to otherize somebody else, the Slavs, for example, to give them features that reflected their backwardness or underdevelopment. I will confine myself to a brief remark on the methods by which this situation has been achieved, briefly mentioning the names of several Polish researchers who have written about it. For example, Tomasz Szarota wrote about the stereotypes of a Pole as a simpleton and a person who is not able to speak German. Isabella Surent highlighted exotization, the use of social and religious differences that were presented as national ones, and the interpretation of relations between two nations in the categories of center-periphery dichotomy. Hubert Orlowski, for example, traced the crystallization of German outer stereotypes in his writing dedicated to the concept of Polnische Wirtschaft. And the significance of the Slavic oikumena, which began behind the Odra, was to play the role of, using the term of Ivar Neumann, of the collective other in the collective imagination of Germans in the modern era. So, were the Poles in the interwar period aware of this, and did the Polish interwar press attach importance to it? Definitely yes, in both cases, because having been a victim of German settler and colonial ambitions in the 19th century, as well as the object of numerous stereotypical prejudice, Poles feared the reactivation of German imperialism. And if we add, for example, to this fact that the re-established Polish state, which gained former German territories, became not only an element of the German collective consciousness, but also an object of its resentment, it's absolutely not surprisingly that the Polish media paid close attention to the processes occurring in the neighboring country. The increased interest to the social political changes in Germany after the Nazis' accession to power by interwar press in Poland can be seen in the large number of reports in leading periodicals. For example, in Polish status of interwar reporting, there is a commonly accepted opinion that there are only 3 or 4 there are a few texts devoted to the Hitler's revolution, but it is not quite true because indeed, we can say that the text or reporters that are really good historical sources are limited. But here you can see, for example, the books which were published in the 1930s and reprinted in Poland in 1990s or 2000s. But the corpus of reportages which are describing the reality of Nazi Germany is not limited by them, because, for example, we can say that this corpus of works includes reports by such journalists as Sabansky, Konrad Wrzos, Bernard Zinger, Zygmunt Nowakowski, but, for example, only in the Ilustrowany Kurier Codzienny or Illustrated Daily Courier, one of the largest national daily newspapers, there were several correspondents who visited Germany at almost the same period of time. Also, the topic of Nazis' rise of power and the social changes they initiate was relevant. The aspects that came into focus for Polish reporters in 1933, 1934 were quite far from colonialism. The carnival of various uniforms, burning of books, the cult of the leader, Gleichschaltung, maybe the profanation of Berlin theater repertoire, immigration, or the situation with Polish workers, or the situation with the Jews, pushed the topic of irredentism and colonialism to the margins. And this could be partly explained by the fact that most of the major reports were written at the dawn of Nazi rule. If Polish journalists did write about the potential military threat from Germany, they mostly perceived these ambitions as revisionism, like Pruszyński did, correlating mostly with the German territorial losses. Konrad Wrzos, who wrote a series of reports entitled When the War Comes Again, was the one who discerned the aggressive intentions of the new German government and began to raise alarms about them out loud. He was trying to reach not only readers in Poland, but also representatives of political elites, because he talked to Dollfuss, Masaryk, French, Belgian, Dutch, and other governmental officials. And it's curious, actually, that the vast majority of his respondents were confident that it's not going to happen. I mean, that it would not come to war, and tended to prioritize the issues connected with the economy over security risks. And if we follow their further lives, the lives of these people, we shall see that for some of them, this was a fatal mistake. At the same time, Wrzos, who, according to his interesting plan, traveled to the country's neighboring Germany and talked extensively with ordinary people, presented a wide range of attitudes towards the Nazi government expressed by those Germans who were not citizens of the Third Reich. Among them were both representatives of irredenta, in particular in Graz, and people who preferred to remain with the new sovereign state, for example, his respondents in Belgium. However, Wrzos underestimate the importance of propaganda and naively believed that the status quo in the land he visited would be maintained for some time. For example, it refers to his false prediction about the Saarland referendum. It should be noted that Polish reporters allowed themselves to speak directly about possible threats to Poland and the Poles. Thus, Ksawery Pruszyński talked about, or he remembering the Anschluss of Austria and German claims to Lithuania and Poland, he described and talked about the reality in which the Poles were pulling out from Plock, Kraków, Sandomierz in railway wagons somewhere to Siberia or Turkestan, and replaced on the liberated territories with German colonists. Sometime later, Bernard Zinger, another correspondent of Nasz Przegląd, daily newspaper, which was popular among the Jews, he, in his article entitled Days of Partition, Bred in German Hands, which describes the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, outlines the territorial boundaries to which German claims probably would extend soon. Here is a quote. Zinger wrote, "There is a huge crowd in the market in front of the bookstore. Several maps are posted. Among them is one that is labeled the German people in Europe. 3/4 of the map are covered by a single solid red line. The strip is the German Reich. Next to it are more red stripes. Alsace and Lorraine in France are covered in the red color of Germanness as well. The Netherlands is also red. This color decorates also Lithuania, Denmark, and Switzerland. Red stripes also mark Hungary and can be seen in Romania and Transylvania. Red stripes are found near Poznan, Pomerania, Upper Silesia, and even in Ukrainian, this might add, in Volhynia. Wherever you look, the German nation appears everywhere." In order to summarize the stories in which Polish interwar reporters dealt with Nazi colonial paradigms, it is worth emphasizing three most important subjects. However, according to, for example, their heritage, it can be said that the first was Lebensraum, or territorial expansion, because Antoni Sobański, for example, wrote about a desire to expand territorially without looking back at the losses of the first World War. Without looking back at the losses of the First World War. He wrote that Germany is the fairest because it promised no happiness, only a huge piece of land ruled by Germans and stretching from colonized Siberia to Nancy and Ghent, and from the Arctic Circle to Barbarossa, Sicily. And despite the fact that Sobański was in general an optimistic person, and did not believe in the likelihood of a new world war, he was quite well aware of the incredibly tragic consequences of trying to achieve such an objective. And he continues that such a colossal state purged of all individualism will be heated with the blood of its sons and the blood of its enemies. But for that, it will be peculiar and isolated from the rest of the world, he predicts. The second narrative is considered to be a longing for what was lost and a desire for justice in the understanding of Germans, because above-mentioned Sobański recalls the magazines that wrote about an exhibition of colonial art, where besides the exhibits themselves, many images from our former colonies we want to take back were presented. Or Konrad Joss, who pointed out that the shadow of the swastika fell on the border areas, and he wrote about Karkonosze, Eipen and Malmö, Graz, Klagenfurt, Schleswig, or Saarbrücken. And the third and the last one narrative is the rigid racial hierarchy and a pseudo-scientific concept of Herrenborg. Nazism, which combined racial views with conspiracy, created a bizarre image of reality that could not escape the notice of Polish reporters. Zygmunt Nowakowski recounted a conversation he heard in Germany during his short stay in this country, and it was a simple dialogue between two bystanders about the occupation of the Rhineland. And the main point was that it was an affair inspired by Jews, which was not surprising given to the context of that time, but more noteworthy, however, was or were the tools they allegedly used. Because according to Nowakowski, the biggest problem was for his German interlocutors was that the French people did not stop with the occupation, but initially tried to send black soldier. And he wrote that, and all this way only to ensure that the beautiful Senegalese men who were popular among perverted German women would spoil the Germanic race. And interestingly, that Bernard Zinker wrote about the same threat in light of the mission of world domination of Nazi Germany. And according to him, in the Germans' view, the French could not claim this role because, for example, France was, as he wrote, was threatened by assimilation with the colored, and Russians were not, who were not only considered as an inferior nation or inferior race by Nazis, but they were also greatly affected by the impurities of Tatar and Mongolian blood. Zinger discussed the theory of the master race in reference to the ideas of Alfred Rosenberg, because according to him, these Estonian-born NSDAP ideologists perceived a leading role for Germans, not Estonians or Latvians or Lithuanians, in the whole Baltic region. And he wrote that Brennenkamp, Korff, Baumgarten, Menzenkamp. Here are the names of these barons and lords who in 1905 massacred the local people. Here I must admit that it was not only about the Estonian, not only and not such about the Estonians, but rather about Russians and Caucasian people. And more even interesting that he continues, just like other Germans did with the Gottentots and Herero people in Africa. So this is an important addition. Antoni Sabansky, in turn, emphasized how sudden the change in the perception of colored people was. It looks especially mind-blowing if we take into account how cosmopolitan and how hospitable Berlin was only a few years before. For example, he knows that the few jazz band musicians and doormen who had arrived before the war from the German colonies and had been successfully naturalized by this time lost their jobs and were doomed to starvation. And he was quite ironic, or maybe it's not a proper word, because he wrote that this was a sad and perhaps only slightly more colorful feature for this enormous national kitsch. And his last story was about the black singer who was also an American citizen and who used to make a large income recently by singing. But he has exhausted all his savings after a long hospitalization, and he doesn't even have enough money to leave Berlin, and he was not allowed to earn money even by singing in the yards. In the nightclub where this man used to perform, concludes Sabansky, the owner collects money from the patrons to send this unfortunate man to Paris. So, in a conclusion, to sum up, we can see that the topic of Nazi colonialism was reflected in Polish interwar reporters, although it was by no means a mainstream topic. Despite the rather sharp and critical responses of Polish journalists to the true nation of national revolution in Germany, which began to appear immediately after the rise of, using a term of Sabansky, his mediocrity the Führer, Polish society was very far from seriously considering it an existential threat to itself. I think that for many reasons. Thank you.
project People, Places, Events. 3 research goals defined his current activities. First, contributions at the intersections of geography, digital humanities and science technology that address the challenges of source-critical approaches in historical, geographical analysis and visualization. Second, empirical studies into the visual perception of mapped information in geographical communication. Thirdly, research and teaching related to the modernist graphic design, visualization pedagogy and its relevance for geographical communication. He has published research on Poland, especially the article The Power of Mapping, considering the discrepancies of Polish cadastral mapping.
And thank you very, very much to the organizers for allowing me to come here and spend some time at the end of the day to tell you a little bit about a concept, shibboleth, that I think some of you might have heard about, but maybe some of you have not, and its relationship to place names. They play a distinct role in the process of colonialization, as I will show. Using Irish theater, and I want to go into that, and I will mainly focus on a few high points from the presentation, but I hope that there's some time afterwards for discussion. I did, though, I was told at the beginning, presenters like to have jokes, and I do have a joke. There's 2 things in the world we can be sure of, says Mark Twain: death and taxes. I would say, though, speaking here mainly to historians, I believe, though, there are actually 2 more things: space and time. It's only a question of how we interpret them.
It's not a joke.
The first part was, though. I said 1. So I jumped ahead a little bit. Let me go back. So here's, can we go on to the next one? I have it. Oh, next slide. Next slide. Good. Now it works. Thank you. Thank you. First, I just want to talk very briefly in this presentation about what is a shibboleth. I'll give you a bit of a definition to start out, and then I'll move to consider how Irish toponyms are shibboleths in its theater. In particular, I'm focusing on the theater because there would be a number of ways to get more in-depth into this. I will largely focus on just the conceptual discussion around one play, Translations by Brian Friel. And then I'll talk about some work that we're doing, not using this concept directly, but which includes this concept to help us understand the processes of working with toponyms, place names, I should say, rather here, in how we can understand the past colonial history of Central Europe. My main conclusion, just to put that out there right away at this point in the day too, is that the understanding of place names is bound to a time and to specific interactions. There's 2 points related. Are we going back? Yep. I think I got this now. I'm going to try and do this. Place names are also shibboleths. They relate and they contextualize interactions in a myriad of ways. They bundle meanings through the naming process. The next point is that shibboleths are inherent to human communication. Place names have multiple meanings. They always have, they always will. When we look at colonizing interactions, whether in Central Europe or in Irish perspective, we can see through its theater how these colonizing interactions take place. Let me move on with the discussion of the definition. What is a shibboleth? There's 3 interpretations that one can distinguish about this. First, there is the biblical concept of a shibboleth, which some of you might remember from the chapter of the Old Testament, Judges, where when the people are told to pronounce a word, the Gileads, as you can read here, they said, well, say now this word, shibboleth. And he said shibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right, says the King James Version of the Bible. And then they took him, and they slew him and 42,000 other people because they could not pronounce shibboleth the way that the Gileads had pronounced it. This is the oldest reference to a shibboleth. There are, of course, hundreds more, and if you look on Wikipedia, you can find many of them. There's also a Polish story for use of a shibboleth in similar context as well. many examples. Oops, let's see, where are we? There. One is the geographical imaginations. We regularly use place names on maps to distinguish places we've never been, we will never go. And we use that to give the map a sense of having a depth, of having a reality, of corresponding to something in the world. That's part of a process of mimesis and also a process of diegesis that allows us to read these names and to weave them into larger narratives, which maps are often a part of, and telling us a story of colonization, for example, as we just heard from Professor Uffelmann. And more recently, place name shibboleths, this concept is used for what's called LAIDO, or language analysis for the determination of origin, where there's a complex protocol that is prepared to talk to people who purport to be refugees and asking for asylum, to distinguish if they actually do come from the original area that they say they would come from. That's another set of usage. And finally, there's one more set of usage, what many of you might have used today, actually, and that is a system called shibboleth, which I'm not going to go into any detail, but it is a single logon system for a computer with a federated identity management. It's not the same as what shibboleth was. That shows you some of the flexibility in this term. When we turn to Ireland, then I would say that you can see many cases in Irish life and Irish theater, as I'll come to now, that shibboleth is related to a social performance and interrogation process that we're regularly involved in Ireland. We're talking about the meaning and pronunciation, as before, as Derrida remarked. It is less about the meaning and more about the pronunciation and its traditional uses. But as we can see from the work of Paul Celan, a Jewish person from Romania who spoke German as a first language, it also becomes something that he called a Sprachgitter. It is a mesh that filters and bears access to various concepts from the past related to a place, for example. It's relevant for boundaries and place names and other spatial representations, as I will show, as we can imagine from just looking at this Irish map. We can think of place names as boundary objects that connect and also separate us. And it's, again, a process of interactions and relationships that are being developed. This does not mean shibboleths are easy to work with. Shibboleths, I would urge anyone who's thinking about taking up this term and using it that you have to be very cautious. In the case of Ireland, for example, shibboleths have been used for over hundreds of years. They can prescribe relations and meanings that came out of a particular colonial context, attitudes and ambitions that people had regarding a place, as we again heard in Professor Uffelmann's talk, which we can see on the ground in Ireland and its long colonial histories. It's about positions, implicit and explicit, that people take towards a place. They can reveal the positionalities and biases of people and their attempts at nominalizing particular concepts of the landscape, as well as looking later to use maps as constructions which will reify a particular way of understanding that place. Maps become thus, with their place names, ways of remembering, of taking apart and putting back together that can help tell these complexities that go beyond just maps and names of memories, but become woven into people's daily lives in rich and complex ways. But part of the challenge is this example here from a discussion in Ireland would show is that several place names become very complex because they are not simply the result of anglizations of older names, but it's a far more complex history related to the Norman invasion of Ireland, related to English invasions of Ireland, related to many changes in Ireland's very complicated and moving historical development and relationship to colonialism. Moving on to the next section, I'd like to talk about Irish toponyms as shibboleths then, and turn particularly to this issue of theater, but I want to give you a bit of context to that. In the interest of time, I'm being very brief here. And that is that while there is in Irish theatre quite a modern focus on the use of place names and their evocative role in the theatre, the place name discussion in Ireland goes back to texts from the 5th century that are still an active part of an Irish discourse with the process of creating a sense of place, of a sense of belonging. Then Seanchach is the concept that is widely used in Ireland, that, as Sean Heaney refers to, it is the traditional legendary law of notable places, which goes back to hundreds, almost 1,000 years now, and becomes a touchstone in Irish discourse, in Irish theatre as well then, for many cultural and engagements with immigration in the past. Ireland is no newcomer to immigration, having seen it over hundreds and hundreds of years, where the place names become synecdoches, where they facilitate a process of making associations. In particular, I want to turn not to the rich usage of shibboleths and place names in Irish theatre, but rather one play in particular called Translations. It was written by Brian Friel. It was first performed and written to during what the Irish euphemistically refer to as the Troubles. It is, and the story is circles around an action propelled by a colonial British mapping and renaming of the Gaelic toponyms in a made-up village by Friel Ballybeg. There's many layers to the play, and one could spend indeed a whole seminar for a whole semester discussing these. The characters, though, what I want to focus on here in this very limited time is that they evoke place names to create and evoke more differences and create associations past and present between the processes of changes which they're part of. Friel is evoking here and using masterly a very clear romantic idealization of place names against the lived places that people are experiencing and how this lived place is changing. It's showing in its performance how the dynamics of language and social change are also taking place through this process of naming, of using place names, of having the place names serve as shibboleths that at the moment still serve to distinguish the very English who are coming with various different agendas and various levels of Irish phobia or Irish philly, and the dynamics of the Irish who are caught up in a process of seeing they have to change their form of agricultural existence, and many of them are starting to look at moving, as my ancestors did too, to the United States to have better opportunities for themselves and their children. Friel's position related to place names and colonization is very simple. His play and the analysis of people who work on these issues in Ireland is that the old place names have no intrinsic relevance. Their relevance comes through the interactions of people. And this is theater, as the play's been performed in multiple languages around the world, here in Minsk, I believe it is, or yes, in Minsk. It is about a spatial organization that the performance of the play evoked through the place names allow people to use, where the shibboleth function allows the characters to distinguish who belongs to which group and which associations they have. There is a necessary uncertainty always around place names that plays out in Friel's play Translations through the interactions and meaning through a struggle between the English and the Irish in the play. They're negotiating differences. They're voicing shadows and silences about their relationship to the world, whether it's the globalized world of the English colonialism or it's the local world of the Irish farmers. They're bringing out the silences that they don't speak by using the place names as shibboleths to distinguish these relationships. They're creating new spaces, and they're rereading old gaps, which are erased in people's lack of a perfect memory of what happened in the past. They're adding and subtracting. They're talking to themselves about what this process is and how they position themselves individually in relationship to all these changes. This is the rich world of Irish theater. I'm now going to move to our approach to possibly taking this up in research, which is not aimed to provide all that richness, but is aimed simply to help researchers work with different types of place names. It's a project where we look at how place names can have many locations. We have a software that we make available on the web. It's called Gazetteer. Oops, I have to keep moving. Gazetteers.net. And with this software, it's possible then to access existing repositories of place names for largely contemporary Poland at this point in time. We can use this environment to compare matching so that we can look at historical place names from different periods, and then through that we're able to provide the researcher who is performing this work can assess to what degree there is a similarity in the matchings that have been found by this comparison and decide how to proceed. I think there's a number of case studies. The partner with this on the project, the Pilecki-Institut in Marburg in Germany, has been involved looking at changes in Wandel. That was a recent PhD by Grigory Kleesberg. And there's obviously many more research projects that this Gazetteers.net supports. And we're looking now, and I'm interested in talking to people about applications they might have for this, about possible ways to use this in other research projects involving your own data and historical data. So let me come to the conclusions now, after going through those 3 points. First, if we're going to decode place names, shibboleths as boundary objects with these interactions that separate and connect can be a helpful analytical concept for understanding the complexity of place names, which are usually underdetermined with many, many meanings. Turning to the mimetic and diegetic practices from theater studies and the role of place names and maps can help discern some of these interactions historically where we no longer have direct access to the characters, the people who are making meanings in this process of working with different place names, with negotiating the shibboleths that place names become. There is perhaps no single relationship to the world, so therefore we're always going to have a place name is always going to be a shibboleth that allows us to distinguish in pronunciation, in emphasis, in the scale that we use the place names with, to distinguish our relationships in a complex globalizing world. But through this analysis, we can work more, I believe, towards a better understanding of relationships that are significant, that are masked in the complexity of place names, and we can contextualize them to help enrich our colonial as well as post-colonial understandings of the processes going on in the world, to understanding that the place names that we often use too in such a map as here of Warsaw are neither stable nor are they secure. They will change. That we can have many overlaps related to the complex relationships we find ourselves in social groups. And that if we're going to rely on an idea of a virtuous past, as literary figures in the past have tried to do, which we again heard before, there's always going to be some kind of unscrupulous place, is a nice way to put it, I think, in English, that that theatrical engagements take up, but we too, in our cultural engagements, working with the colonial pasts of Central Europe, can taking it up And that would help, too, to avoid a reification of place names, which can be toxic for the discussion, which can be toxic to the research. In that sense, we can look at not only the place names, but also the limits of mapping that are related to place names always as challenges that we face. Because we tend often in our day-to-day lives and in our work often to turn to a map of spatial representation or of place names too, that is a referent. But it is a polyvocal world that was then and is now, that we can account for the fluidity of contemporary societies. This was an argument of Zygmunt Bauman, but I think it also applies to historical interpretive research in the past, that we need to avoid the reductions and look at mimesis and digesis, the points I'm trying to stress here, to allow us to consider the complex relationships that include gender, identity, perspectives, and the richness of culture in relationships to a complex world. A location is not a place. One more point I wanted to make, but it can correspond to place names. And therefore, we come to a complex relationship that shibboleths will always have relations and context. We can use these shibboleths to help start to understand these complex associations that people make, and we can therefore also untangle some of the complexity, the graphic rhetoric of maps to help us with our research. With that, I think my time is up. I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, and now is the time for the joint discussion session. So if does anyone have questions to any of the three speakers?
Are we supposed to sit up here, or can we go? Yeah. Okay. Because there's two of us. You're there. Great.
Does anyone have questions?
Just a question to Professor Harvey, as he reminded me of my short study when I tried to identify the changing geopolitical location of a state, because I observed that Polish ministers of foreign affairs, they defined Poland in a very different way from 1989 to about 2015. And it started with Poland is an Eastern European country, then Central European country, then Central Eastern, the core of Europe, the center of Europe, the member of European community, and then suddenly about 2011 and 13, I read in one of the speeches of the ministers of affairs that Poland is a Nordic country, and it was also supported in some voices of media also in Germany. The idea behind it was that Poland started to behave as a Nordic country in Europe. It changed very quickly after the elections in 2015, when Poland turned again to the Central Eastern and then Eastern European country. And the question is, have you also been working with such wider definitions of locations? I mean, with political background, also geopolitical background?
Yes. Thank you for the question. The short answer is no, I have not, but we've dealt with these complexes in more, I think, what people would tend to call microhistory. So the larger questions that you're pointing to in these shifts are an issue that can be approached with this concept of the shibboleth and how it's related, how it's tied to interactions that are changing in a globalized world. So that I think could be valuable there.
Any other questions?
Okay, so I got a question to Professor Uffelmann. You are saying like about this idea of writing the story, which basically is saying the story, but on the other hand, it's somewhere deeper and it's depicting some experience of the writer himself and also the experience of the nation, let's say. But nevertheless, Sienkiewicz and other literary figures from this period of time, they were very much orientalizing what they were writing about. In this case, Indians, for example. And my question is, like, in your session, from where it came from? I mean, was it coming from the Germans who were occupying Poland back then, from the Russians, or it was just some kind of zeitgeist and it was just the way how the whole world was writing in the 19th century about the other?
I've skipped a paragraph devoted to the entangled position of Sienkiewicz as a citizen of Warsaw, so living in the Russian-occupied territory, often rather depicting Prussian processes of colonialism, which are then on yet another level allegorical of his actual position as a citizen of the Russian Empire. So this is a kind of Aesopian language, as we say in Slavic studies, avoiding censorship and shifting topics to an allowed allegorical realm. So I find that this first range, second range writer, as Gombrowicz said, has something to tell for a sophisticated analysis. And I think that it is not just dumb warriors who are the interesting heroes of Sienkiewicz, but critical depictions, especially of male stupidity. And there is something to do about masculinity studies and Sienkiewicz.
Any more questions?
Hey. Thank you very much to all the speakers for very interesting and stimulating presentations. But I would have a question to Dr. Usatenko, which might not directly be associated with the topic, but the research that you did for your presentation, because it struck me when you referred to the origins of certain perspectives on Poland and Central Eastern European nations in general, like, I mean, how deeply they went into and how deeply they originated in certain narratives by German authors. For instance, the idea of the fixation on the religious character of Poles and so on. It really struck me how pervasive certain stereotypes are still present in the depiction of Central and Eastern European nations in the contemporary documentaries and TV reportage. The extent to which a lot of the documentaries about Poland and other countries in the region are very formulaic, and to a certain extent one might even play a little bit of a bingo when looking at what themes are being used in these, like the religiousness, some sort of a connection, like exotization of the folk music, for instance, used as a background music in a lot of these. So essentially my question is to what extent your research on the topic of the interwar reportage would you find relevant to those questions these days, the depiction and the this long-term implications of this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for a brilliant but probably very wide question. I guess that this investigation in this field can be a topic not only for a speech or a mini lecture, but for a course of lectures. And it's I'm wondering whether I think that of course it's absolutely obvious that there are some prejudice and some stereotypes, auto stereotypes, some post-colonial thinking about the Ukrainians, the Poles, which have been reflected in, let's say, movies, in popular culture. But what strikes me when I was listening to your questions that a few years ago in Kiev, in the Ukrainian capital capital city university, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, a conference entitled I can't be mistaken, but entitled "The Parallels Between the Images of Irishmen and the Ukrainians" was held. Yes, so I think that it is interesting not only to focus on that issues you've already mentioned, yes, but maybe even wider, yes, maybe even we have like Professor Dirk Uffelmann said, probably we have to observe this problem maybe in more wide prism. For example, we, as I already mentioned about Isabella Seront approach, according to which some of, let's say, some of distinguished were taken not from the national paradigm, but from the social and religious ones. And probably it would be interesting to see how it was, for example, in the cases of, let's say, Ireland, yes, which was described as inner exotic people on the borders with England, yes, and how it was in, for example, in cases in, let's say, with the Polish people, yes. For example, Seront made it with the local citizens of Upper Silesia, but maybe rather interesting and curious would be to compare, for example, the images of, let's say, wild men of periphery, let's say Huzuls or Boykis or Lemkis or somebody else. So I think that it is very interesting and very complicated question, and I think that it might be, for example, reflected in the studies, not only in some historical studies, yes, but as well in cultural studies, in, for example, studies of, let's say, the history of ideas and so on.
Okay, does anyone else have questions?
Question to Professor Harvey. You showed us a map of Warsaw where the tags were wrong. Is this a kind of riddle to the audience and a kind of topographical shibboleth? And I would like to add to this question that I came across this problem when it comes to the topography of Warsaw when using Airbnb, and having studied in Warsaw, I know where I want to stay. And then the place is shown somewhere, and it turns out later, when the address is displayed, that it is 3 kilometers far away. Can you say anything about the unreliability of Warsaw?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a problem many of us face. The answer is, the modern answer to this is the word marketing. By people using a toponym that is more attractive, they're going to attract more people that go there. You may know exactly where you want to be, but not everyone will know that Wola, for example, is an area rather far away in my terms from Śródmieścia. So people are not going to always know these relationships, and without this knowledge of relationship, toponyms can be used in the capitalist economy to sell things better. That's Airbnb, I think. Not toponyms, or not place names, but just capitalist business, which is a special topic for work with place names.
Are there any more questions? Okay, so thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to all of you who asked the questions, and I think it's time for a break.